The last thing she ever wrote to her mother was 7 words. 7 words typed quickly, the way a soldier types when time is running short, and there are 1,000 things to do, and the convoy's about to move. She wrote, "We are going in. Take care of the babies." That was it. No long goodbye. No dramatic farewell. Just 7 words from a 23-year-old mother to her own mother, asking her to watch over a 4-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl while she drove into a war zone. And then the screen went dark, and the connection closed, and Lori Piestewa picked up her rifle and went toward her Humvee in the gray morning light of the Iraqi desert. Her mother Percy read those words standing in her kitchen in Tuba City, Arizona, and something in her chest moved in a way she had never felt before. Call it a mother's intuition. Call it the ancient, wordless knowing that passes between a woman and the daughter she carried. Percy Piestewa read those 7 words, and she knew, in some deep wordless place that lives below thought and below language, that something was coming. She did not know what. She could not have known what. But she held that phone for a long time after the message stopped, standing in her kitchen in the high desert of Arizona, standing in the silence, and she prayed. She prayed harder than she had ever prayed in her life. She prayed all the way until the morning that 2 men in military dress uniforms knocked on her door and changed everything. And she has been praying every single day since. This is the story of Lori Piestewa, the first Native American woman in the entire history of the United States military to die in combat. A mother, a daughter, a soldier, a woman whose name is now written across a mountain and a freeway in the state that loved her, and whose spirit, according to her little girl, still visits when the rain comes and the doors open for no reason. This is her story, and it will stay with you long after it is finished. She came from the oldest kind of America, not the America of highways and shopping malls and television, the America of red rock and high desert and sky so enormous and so blue it makes you feel at once completely insignificant and completely alive. Tuba City, Arizona, sits on the edge of the Navajo Nation reservation in the northeastern part of the state, surrounded by the Colorado Plateau, a landscape so ancient it feels like the beginning of time. The Hopi people have lived in this part of the world for centuries, and they carry that history in the way they pray, in the way they grieve, in the way they celebrate, in the ceremonies that mark every season and every transition in a human life. This was the world Lori Ann Piestewa was born into on December 14, 1979. Her Hopi name, given at birth, was Kokahanmana White Bear Girl. It was a name that suited her in every possible way, because Lori Piestewa was fierce and she was gentle, and she was loyal and she was fierce again, in that particular order, in that particular combination, and she never let you forget which one she was being at any given moment. Her father Terry was a full-blooded Hopi man who had served in the United States Army in Vietnam. He had been drafted, the way men of his generation were drafted, and he had gone, the way men of his character went, not because he had a choice, but because when his country called, the warrior tradition that his people had carried for generations answered before his own fear could say anything at all. Her mother Percy was Mexican, American, a woman of warmth and faith and practical wisdom, the kind of woman who holds a family together not with speeches, but with the daily, invisible work of love. Lori was the youngest of 4 children, the baby of the family, which in theory meant she was the most sheltered and, in practice, meant she was the most fierce, had spent her whole childhood trying to keep up with 3 older siblings who were not interested in slowing down for anyone. Her grandfather had served in World War II in the European theater. Service was not a concept in this family. It was a language. It was the water they swam in. And Lori had been swimming in it since before she could name what it was. She was an athlete the way that certain people are athletes, not just talented but genuinely unable to imagine herself standing still while other people moved. She played shortstop and second base on the Tuba City high school softball team, her arm precise and her reflexes quick, her competitive instinct so sharp that her teammates loved her for it, and her opponents learned to respect it. She was the commanding officer of Junior ROTC, and she used that position the way she used everything she was given, as an opportunity to prove something, not to other people but to herself, that she was exactly what she believed herself to be. She would challenge the boys in her unit to competitions, and she would beat them, not to humiliate them, but because the idea that being a woman placed a ceiling on what she could do was simply not something her brain was willing to accept as a fact. She had been raised in a warrior tradition. She was a warrior. Gender was a detail that other people seemed more concerned about than she was. There is a story her friend told years later that reaches right into the center of who she was. A group of them were driving from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to Myrtle Beach on a weekend trip when Lori suddenly hit the brakes and stopped the car in the middle of the road. Everyone lurched forward in their seats. What happened? What happened? And Lori was already out of the car, crouching down in the middle of the road, carefully picking up a turtle that had been making its slow way across the asphalt and was now completely vulnerable to every car that came along. She did not move it to the side of the road. She did not set it down in the grass and drive away. She put that turtle in the car and she took it home with her, and she named it Myrtle. Myrtle the turtle lived in Tuba City, Arizona, for years after Lori came back from North Carolina, and reportedly did not pass away until long after Lori herself was gone. That story tells you everything. She could not drive past something that needed help. It was constitutionally impossible for her. It did not matter whether that thing was a turtle or a broken down truck or a best friend who had no ride when the convoy was about to move. She was married young, the way people sometimes are when love arrives before wisdom has had time to fully develop. She married a Navajo man named Bill Wetterock, a high school sweetheart who enlisted in the Army and took her with him to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where they were both very far from the red rock and the high sky of Tuba City, but making something new together. In May 1998, she gave birth to a son. They named him Brandon Terry, after her father, and when you know that detail it tells you something about what kind of daughter she was. In 1999, a daughter arrived. They named her Carla Lynn. And then the marriage came apart, the way some marriages do when two young people realize that the love that brought them together was not enough to build a life on. And by October 2000, Bill had been discharged from the Army, and they had moved back to Arizona and separated, and Lori was a single mother of 2 children under the age of 2, living with her parents in Tuba City, looking at a horizon that offered very few options for a young woman without a degree in a community where jobs were scarce and the future was not immediately obvious. And so she enlisted. She walked into the Army recruiting station in October 2001, 3 years after her son was born and 2 years after her daughter, and she signed her name and became a soldier. The children were left with her parents, who raised them as their own while Lori trained and deployed. She was assigned to the 507th Maintenance Company at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, a support unit, not a combat unit. The kind of assignment that was supposed to keep a woman and a mother safely behind the front lines, away from the bullets and the fire and the decisions that nobody should ever have to make. The Army had rules about this. Women were not supposed to be in direct combat. Lori Piestewa was never supposed to be in danger. That detail matters, hold on to it. She met Jessica Lynch at Fort Bliss in February of 2002. Lynch had been warned that Piestewa was difficult to live with, hard and demanding, not the easiest roommate. Lynch arrived cautious and left that caution somewhere on the floor of their shared room within approximately 48 hours, because whatever Lori Piestewa was, difficult was not the word for it. Lynch said later that it was the most instant connection she had ever felt with another person, that they did everything together, that if you wanted to find Jessica you found Pi first, and Jessica was never far behind. They were inseparable. They were tent mates in the desert. They were the kind of friends who could communicate entire conversations with a look across a crowded room. They were the kind of friends that some people spend their entire lives looking for and never find. In January of 2003, the 507th Maintenance Company was notified of their deployment orders. They were going to Iraq. The invasion was coming. And here is the detail that will stop you cold if you sit with it long enough. Lori Piestewa had injured her shoulder in a training exercise and had undergone surgery to repair it. She was still recovering. The Army, following its own regulations, gave her the option to save HUD at Fort Bliss while her unit deployed. She did not have to go. Her shoulder was a legitimate medical reason to remain stateside, to be near her children, to be safe. And Lori Piestewa went to her supervisors and told them her shoulder was healed. She convinced he was fit for deployment. She volunteered to go. Because Jessica Lynch was going, and she was not going to let her best friend walk into a war without her. Because her unit was going, and she was not the kind of soldier who let her unit go without her. Because she was Lori Piestewa, White Bear Girl, raised in a warrior tradition, the commanding officer of Junior ROTC, the woman who stopped the car for a turtle, the mother who wrote "Take care of the babies" before she drove into the desert. She was going. There was never any other version of this story. In February 2003, they shipped out to the Middle East. March arrived, and with it the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The invasion of Iraq began on March 20, 2003, with a massive coalition force pushing north from toward Baghdad in a strategy of overwhelming speed and force. The 5th or 7th Maintenance Company was part of that northward push, a convoy of supply trucks and support vehicles moving through the Iraqi desert in the churned dust of a war just days old. On March 23, 2003, the convoy set out from Kuwait heading north. The plan was to bypass the city of Nasiriyah, a city on the Euphrates River in southern Iraq, to stay well clear of it, to move around its edges and continue north toward their assigned position. That was the plan. But somewhere in the flat, featureless desert, with no landmarks and no clear roads, and the disorienting sameness that the Iraqi landscape pressed to eyes that have never navigated it before, the convoy took a wrong turn. They drove into Nasiriyah. Earlier in that March, Jessica Lynch's truck broke down. The vehicle she had been riding in, hauling a trailer full of water, stalled on the road and would not move. And Lori Piestewa, driving her Humvee at the back of the convoy, pulled over and called out to her best friend. She said, "Get in." Lynch climbed in. Several other soldiers climbed in too. And the Humvee that was never supposed to be in a combat zone rolled forward into a city that was about to become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. For any American soldier that day, Iraqi forces and militia had seen the convoy entering the city. They had time to prepare. They took positions on rooftops, in doorways, in ditches along the side of the roads, and when the convoy moved deeper into the city, and the first shots were fired, there was suddenly fire coming from every direction, a wall of sound and smoke and bullets that the soldiers of the 507th had never trained for, and were never supposed to face. The convoy commander ordered them to turn around. Turning a convoy around in a narrow city street, while people are shooting at you from every rooftop, is not a maneuver that goes smoothly. Vehicles stalled, trucks blocked each other, and the fire kept coming. Lori Piestewa drove at 45 miles per hour through streets designed for much slower movement, weaving the Humvee through the fire, trying to keep the vehicle moving, trying to keep her people alive. Jessica Lynch said she was not afraid in those first moments, because she was with Lori, and when you with Lori you felt like whatever came at you, the two of you were going to face it together. The Army investigation would later describe what Piestewa threw as a torrent of fire. Rockets, machine guns, small arms from every direction. She drove through it. She kept driving. She kept her people alive through street after street of that torrent until a rocket propelled hit the left front wheel well of her Humvee. The explosion sent the vehicle slamming into a disabled tractor trailer that had stopped in the road ahead of them. 3 soldiers were killed instantly in the crash. Lori survived the impact. She was gravely wounded, her head injury severe, but she was breathing. She was alive. She had driven her people through a torrent of fire, and she was still alive. Iraqi soldiers came for the survivors. Lynch and Piestewa and several others were taken from the wreckage and transported to a civilian hospital in Nasiriyah. And in a civilian hospital in a city at war, with the electricity cutting out, and the equipment inadequate, and the conditions impossible, Lori Piestewa's body reached the edge of what it had left to give. Her head injury was beyond what could be treated in that place, in those conditions at that moment in time. She died in that hospital. She was 23 years old. Her daughter Carla was 3. Her son Brandon was 4. And back in Tuba City, in a house full of photographs and the quiet presence of 2 small children, who did not yet fully understand what had happened, Percy Piestewa was keeping them safe, the way Lori had asked, because that was the last thing her daughter had ever asked of her. For more than a week after the ambush, the family did not know whether Lori was alive or dead. She was listed as missing in action. And in that long, terrible week of not knowing, Tuba City did something that tells you exactly what kind of place it is and exactly what Lori Piestewa was. Every evening at 6 o'clock, The Hopi people held a prayer vigil for her, timed to coincide with daybreak in Iraq, sending their prayers across the earth to find her wherever she was. And across the town, people hung signs in their windows and on their doors. They said, "Put your porch light on. Show Lori the way home." In a desert town in Arizona, people turned on their porch lights and faced them outward into the night, and they prayed their home from a war she was never supposed to be in. And then the Hopi and the Navajo, two nations with centuries of complicated history between them, came together in joint prayer for the first time in living memory, not because someone organized it, not because a politician called for unity, but because a girl from Tuba City was missing in Iraq, and she belonged to both of them, and neither of them was going to let the other grieve alone. That is what Lori Piestewa did to the world around her. She brought people together. She had always brought people together. Her mother Percy said years later that this was her purpose on this earth, to bring people together in peace and unity. Percy said it simply, the way people say the truest things, without decoration, without drama, just the plain fact of it stated plainly. On April 1, 9 days after the ambush, United States Special Forces conducted a raid on that hospital in Syria. They rescued Jessica Lynch, who had been held as a prisoner of war. And in the same operation, behind the hospital building, they found a mass shallow grave. One of the bodies recovered from that grave was identified as Lori Ann Piestewa. She had survived the crash. She had survived the initial hours. And then she had died in that hospital far from the high desert and the red rock and the vast blue sky and the two small children who were sleeping in her parents' house in Tuba City with their grandmother watching over them. Because Lori had asked her to. She came home. Not the way anyone wanted her to come home. But she came home. Brandon Piestewa was 4 years old when his mother drove away. He has a therapist who once told him that trauma erases the ordinary and leaves only the extraordinary, the most in a way that has no explanation. Carla tells her family that her mommy has come to see them. Her grandmother Percy says you can feel it when it happens. She says Carla carries an aura around her on those days, a lightness that is unmistakably Lori, as if the love that drove a young mother to stop a car for a turtle and pick up her best friend in a broken down truck and drive through a torrent of fire is not the kind of love that simply stops when a body does. Piestewa Peak stands in Phoenix, over 2,600 feet high, visible from across the city. The Piestewa Freeway runs beneath it. The Lori Piestewa National Native American Games take place every year in her home state, bringing thousands of indigenous athletes from over 50 tribes to compete in her name, the largest event of its kind in the country. A hall at Fort Moore bears her name. A tree at White Sands Missile Range was planted for her. Hundreds of bikers, the Navajo, Hopi honor riders, ride 400 miles every year to visit Gold Star families, a tradition that started with 20 riders who went to see the Piestewa family in 2003 and has grown into something Lori herself would have loved, people of different nations riding together, honoring something they share, refusing to let a name be forgotten. Specialist Lori Ann Piestewa, Purple Heart, Prisoner of War Medal, the first Native American woman in the history of the United States military to die in combat, born December 14, 1979 in Tuba City, Arizona, killed in action March 23, 2003, in Syria, Iraq. 23 years old, a mother of two, a daughter, a best friend, a warrior from the oldest kind of America, raised in a tradition of service that stretched back through her father and her grandfather and further still into centuries of a people who understood that some things are worth giving everything for. She wrote 7 words to her mother before she drove into that desert. Take care of the babies. And her mother did. Her mother took care of the babies. And the babies grew up. And they carry her name. And a mountain in Phoenix carries her name. And a people carry her memory. And somewhere in Tuba City, when the rain comes and the doors open for no reason, a little girl who is now a young woman smiles and says her mommy came to visit. Put your porch light on. Show Lori the way home. She earned it. She earned every light in every window. She earned every prayer and every mountain and every mile those bikers ride and every game those athletes play. She earned all of it in a Humvee going 45 miles per hour through a torrent of fire on a road she was never supposed to be on, because her best friend needed a ride and her unit needed a driver, and she was Lori Piestewa, and she could not, she simply could not, drive past someone who needed her.